Welcome to ICS Arabia podcast. Today, I hope it's a nice day for everybody. And we have a very special guest from Australia, Sydney City, Fahad Mughal. Hi, Fahad. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Suleiman. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is mine. Fahad Mughal is a cybersecurity consultant, and he's been working in the field for many years. And he has, I'm sure now, lots of insights and experiences to share with us. So before we dig into OT security and our favorite topic, let's get to know Fahad. Please tell us about your journey. I know that you worked in Kuwait in the past, and the cybersecurity and IT as well. So we have something common, me and him. And I met him in Kuwait a few months ago, before the war, and I was really happy to meet him and get to know him. That's why I invited him to the podcast, because I'm sure he has some value to share with us. Please tell us about you and how did you get started and your study and everything.
Thank you, Dr. Suleiman. Again, very pleased to be here. I've been a regular viewer of your podcasts, and I really appreciate the knowledge, the practical insights, and the security conversations that your platform brings to life, right? Now, by way of introduction, my name is Fahad Mughal. As you already mentioned, I work as a cybersecurity consultant and advisor. I'm based out of Sydney, Australia. My work focuses on helping critical infrastructure organizations improve their OT and IT cybersecurity posture. For your non-Arabic speaking viewers, the name Fahad, it roughly translates to Black Panther. Yeah, you heard it right, Black Panther. So hopefully that makes my name easier to remember for everyone now. See, my early cybersecurity career started in the banking and financial services industry. And because banking is such a highly regulated and security conscious sector, it gave me the opportunity to understand, design, and work with some of the most mature security technologies and controls that are out there, right? Uh, it gave me the experience and the insights in both the offensive and the defensive sides of the cyber landscape, which has eventually helped shape my foundation in cybersecurity itself. Uh, so overall, I have 18 plus years of experience in the industry, but if I were to talk for the past 8 to 10 years, my work has gradually moved deeper into critical infrastructure sectors where industrial automation and control systems underpin their real world operations. So I've had opportunity to work in multi-year cyber uplift programs of work in the water and wastewater utility sector. And for the past 5 years, I've been working heavily in the transportation sector, particularly in railway, metro, road traffic signaling environments. Um, and across these critical infrastructure environments, I've worked on areas such as OT security architecture, OT network segmentation, OT SOC capability enablement, development of OT threat detection strategies, developing overall OT cyber strategy and capability roadmaps. Uh, and of course, the topic of today's discussion, OT cybersecurity risk assessments, aligned to the 62443 Part 3-2 standard. So that's my experience and my career in a nutshell.
Well, you made it very, very, very simple, but I'm sure there is more to know about it while we discuss. And by the way, my father's name is Fahad as well. So
great.
you have a very special name to me. So
yes, it is a very common name in that
yes,
part of the world.
yes. And okay, so you just mentioned risk assessment, and I'm sure you've worked in banks and you've dealt with IT risk assessment. And with, of course, lots of experience. How did you find it different from the OT risk assessment when you moved to OT side?
See, that's an important question, and right. And one common mistake I see is that organizations sometimes try to assess the OT cyber risks using the same lens or the same mindset they use for evaluating the enterprise IT risk. Now, in IT, the focus is usually around data, applications, identity platforms, business systems, and the classical, your confidentiality, integrity, and availability model. Now, this is all relevant in OT as well, right? Don't get me wrong. This is all very much relevant, but it is not enough. In operational technology landscape, the systems are connected to physical processes, operational functions. So the question is not only can this particular server be compromised,
Okay.
Or can this particular data be stolen? The better question is, if the system is compromised, what could happen to the operation itself, right? Could it affect safety? Could it disrupt a service? Could it impact process visibility? Could it affect the integrity of control commands, for instance? Could it create any environmental consequences, right? So it's a sort of a different mindset and a lens we use when we do these particular OT risk assessments, right? And I'll give you a simple example here. In the context of a Windows workstation, for instance, right? In enterprise IT, it may just be a normal user endpoint, but in the OT landscape, that same type of workstation or endpoint could be an engineering workstation used to configure PLCs, signaling system, protection relays. So the technology may look familiar, but the consequence of compromise can be very different, right? And the same applies to availability as well. In IT, for instance, we may be able to patch quickly, restart systems, or take systems offline during a maintenance window. In OT, that may not be so simple. Many systems support 24 by 7 operations. They have long life cycles. There is dependency on maintenance and integration service providers. And these systems cannot be interrupted easily without affecting the physical process or service continuity. So for me, the key difference is this. In IT, we often assess risk around information systems and business impact. In OT, we need to assess risk around operational functions and operational consequences. So the asset is important, but the function it supports is even more important. And that is why the OT risk assessments needs cyber knowledge, but it also needs engineering context. It needs operational context. It needs safety awareness. And it also needs a clear understanding of system interdependencies as well. So that's how I see, the difference between when we perform the assessments between the IT world and the OT world. And it's a change of a mindset, basically. Hope that answers your question there.
Sure, yes, very clearly. And I agree totally with you. I mean, there are some considerations you have to consider while doing OT that they are not available in IT. Fully agree. Why do you think, or the value in terms of value, why do you think some organizations they fail to create real value when it comes to OT organizations?
So it's an important point now, because see, when we talk about purely OT risk assessments, for instance, if you take that example, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is not that organizations do not perform risk assessments. The problem is that the risk assessment does not always translate into meaningful security decisions. And there could be several reasons, right? But from my humble experience, uh, I would say that there are at least, what I've seen, 6 to 7 points, basically, just for the benefit of your listeners, where I see organizations often fail to create the right sort of value from these risk assessments. The first point is that risk assessments within the OT environments can become sometimes too compliance driven. So the organization may need a report, for instance, they might need a risk register or an evidence to support their audit purpose. Now that is understandable, but if the assessment just stops there with a document with a risk report and a risk register, then it's not creating the right sort of value, right? So that's one aspect that I've seen in the organizations. The second aspect is that sometimes there are very unclear system boundaries. Uh, and in OT environments, it is not always obvious where the system starts and where it ends. You may have, for instance, central servers, engineering workstations, field devices, communication networks, your integrations with the enterprise IT, for instance. Now,
Mhm.
if the boundary is not defined correctly or if it's defined too narrowly, the assessment may miss the real exposure. And that's another point where it fails to then create the right sort of value, right?
Mhm.
Third point is that sometimes, and most of the times, the information is incomplete or outdated. So the asset inventories may not be complete, and it's mostly not complete. Architecture diagrams may not fully reflect the current environment. Sometimes the system integrator or the maintainer, they understand the parts of the system better than the asset owner, and that creates challenges, right, when trying to assess the risk properly. So for instance, a design diagram may show good segmentation on paper, but when you look at the operational support parts, your vendor access parts, your temporary engineering laptops that are connecting into the network, for instance, the the real environment may be more interconnected than the diagram suggests. Uh, the fourth uh, point is that the assessment sometimes may focus too much on technical vulnerabilities, and I've seen that it's very common, and not enough on operational consequences. So a vulnerability by itself is useful information, but in OT, the real question is, what function does this asset support? And what happens if that function is disrupted or manipulated, right? I'll give you an example, a real world example. Like some years back, I was facilitating a risk workshop for one of my clients in Middle East, uh, who are responsible for the road traffic signaling control system for the entire city itself, right? Now, in that workshop, we had a mix of people, the asset owners, system SMEs, uh, network people, IT people, some risk people as well. Now, my particular style of when I'm running these particular workshops is to present a cyber threat scenario for that particular system, whatever we are discussing, the control system, and then present the consequence that if this particular risk scenario were to occur, this could be the consequence. Now, and then ask for their opinion. Now if you give them just this scenario and the consequence only, they might say, see, it's not possible, it's very far-fetched, and that's very common when you get into these particular workshops. But fortunately, there was at the same time a pen test engagement that we were doing across the environment itself to help with this particular risk workshop. And when we tied back the pen test finding on the next slide with the same scenario and the consequence, then the tone in that particular workshop changed. People started to then think, and immediately they changed the mindset of the people in the room, uh, because they could actually see that, okay, there is a particular vulnerability which can be exploited, and which can actually lead to this threat scenario and this particular consequence, right? So the point here is that we shouldn't be focusing too much on technical vulnerabilities, but we need to link it back to the operational consequence. And that is where these sort of assessments actually create values, right? Fifth point is that, and I mentioned this, in that real world scenario, it's about these risk workshops. Sometimes these risk workshops involve the wrong mix of people. If cybersecurity is in the room, but operations, engineering, safety, asset owners, or the operator maintainers are not there, then the assessment might miss the real operational context, right? And the final point that I would like to make here is that the output of these assessments sometimes do not connect to the right actions. So if the final outcome does not influence security architecture, network segmentation, access control, or your monitoring priorities, then the assessment has not reached its full value. So, for me, a good OT risk assessment should always answer these practical questions if you are to have the right value out of this, right? What are we protecting?
Yes.
What could go wrong? What would the consequence be? And what decisions do we need to make next? So if we can answer these questions, right, then we can actually see the real value come out of this. And this is where I feel that the part 3-2 standard of the 62443 series is very useful. Not because that it magically solves all the problems, that it's a silver bullet, no, not because of that, but because it gives us a very structured way to think and ask the right questions and turn a messy OT environment into a very disciplined risk conversation. And that's where it's very helpful. So yeah, I
Yes.
guess that answers a bit of your question, I guess.
Yes. And you mentioned many points. Can we come across those points again, like fast, like 1, 2, 3, 4? Why? How to add value, please?
Sure. So, okay, coming back to those points, I mentioned that number one was that these risk assessments can be very compliance driven, that you're
Yes.
doing it just for the audit purpose and stuff, and you're not
Yes.
taking, making right security decisions after that. Uh,
Yes.
the second point was you would have uh, unclear system boundaries defined, so you don't understand where the access points of those particular systems reside, and where are the boundaries for that particular system. The third point was that you don't if you don't have the correct asset inventory or the architectural view, then you will miss that particular assessment, the real value. uh, Fourth point was that you need to have the right mix of people in the workshops, right? You need to have cross-disciplinary people present in that workshop if you want to get the right sort of value out of it. Fifth point was that you don't want to focus too much on technical vulnerabilities, right? You need to
All right.
map those technical vulnerabilities to operational consequence. Only then it will create the right sort of value. And the last point, if my memory serves me right, was that these particular risk assessments should drive actions. So the output should clearly tell you what should be the next steps, what would be your next actions. So I would sort of, carve them down into these 6 points if you want to create a good value out of these assessments.
Sure. And thank you. And you just mentioned that the ISA 62443 is a good standard to use to apply the criteria that you, or the requirement that you mentioned. Why is that? Why ISO 62443? Why not other standard, you think? And if it's, let's focus on ISO 62443, what value does it provide for risk assessment?
Sure. See, the part 3-2 of the IC 62443 series of a standard, it basically provides a structured approach for performing cybersecurity risk assessments, okay, for industrial automation and control systems environment, with the aim of supporting secure system design. Now, it does not give you a checklist to follow blindly, but it gives you a very disciplined sequence for thinking about OT cybersecurity risk. And just for the benefit of your viewers, right, I'll simplify it in this manner, in this particular logical flow. So, what it says is that first you go in and define your system under consideration, right? What system or operational environment are we assessing? What is the boundary? What are the access points? So once you have done with this system under consideration as the first step, the next step is to perform an initial cybersecurity risk assessment. And it's a very sort of a high level risk assessment that you perform. And this is where we try to understand the worst case consequences if the system is disrupted, manipulated, or breached, right? So once you have gone with this particular second step, you move on to the third step of defining or partitioning the system into zones and conduits. Now, this helps you group your assets with similar risk or security requirements and helps us understand how different parts of the environment communicate, right? So that would be your third step. Now, if required, and if the organization's risk tolerance uh, requires it, then you would move into a step of performing a detailed risk assessment. Now, in this detailed risk assessment part, you will take all the zones and conduits that you have defined in the previous step, and you start to look more closely at the threats, at the vulnerabilities, at the consequences, at the likelihood. You try to look at the existing countermeasures that are there. You evaluate the residual risk. You try to come up with then the additional countermeasures that are required. And this is also where the concept of target security level comes into play as well, as we call it the SLT in the either 62443 terminology. Now, in simple terms, SLT is the desired level of security for a system, zone, or a conduit based on the risk assessment, right? So it helps communicate how much protection is needed for a particular zone or a conduit and guides the selection of the right sort of security requirements and countermeasures. And I think this is a very useful distinction here because the current state and the target state are not always the same. So, for instance, a zone may have currently very weak controls, but based on the risk assessment, the organization may determine that it needs a higher target security level. And that gap then becomes part of the design and implementation conversation, right? And this is also where the part 3-2 of the standard, because as we know, this IC 62443 is a series of standards, right? So 3-2 is particularly for performing the cybersecurity risk assessments.
Yes.
But then this connects naturally with the part 3-3 standard, which helps us determine what sort of security requirements and capabilities we need to achieve that particular protection or SLT level that we have defined by that risk assessment. So it gives you the connectivity by connecting those dots. First you have defined the risk assessment. Through the risk assessment, you define the SLT, the system level target, and then you can look at the 3-3 to come up with the right sort of security requirements and the countermeasures that might be required. Uh, One of the most important outputs of this 3-2 standard is also the cybersecurity requirements specification that sort of comes at the end. And this is where the risk assessment becomes very actionable. It captures the security requirements for the zones and the conduits. It defines your threat environment. It defines your regulatory requirements, for instance, and it is then used to guide your decision for the design and implementation of your particular controls, right?
Yes.
So for me, the value of 3-2 part 3-2 of the 643 standard is that it connects the dots, as I mentioned earlier. It helps move from system understanding to risk evaluation, then to target security levels, and then
Hmm.
defining the security requirements, and finally, the accountable decision making. Because in the end, the standard says that you need to bring in the asset owner approval, right? And I think it is very important because the cyber teams can facilitate these risk assessments, these workshops, but the asset owner is ultimately accountable for the safety, integrity, and the reliability of the operational process itself. So their buy-in is the most important aspect here, right? And that's where you come to the end and start to shape up the the relevant design artifacts then. So this is where I feel the 3-2 brings the structure to the chaos, I would say.
So 3-2 is our friend then, our
Definitely. Yes, definitely.
our most important friend.
Yes.
Who decides the security level target? Is it the asset owner or the consultant that who's doing the risk assessment?
So yes, so it normally what I've seen, it is a very cumulative exercise, in a sense that once you have done those particular risk workshops, the findings of these workshops actually go to the asset owners and the relevant stakeholders itself, right? And uh, it definitely then requires a broad set of approvals, which includes the asset owner as well.
Yes.
So I would say that yes, eventually it's sort of is an exercise where multiple people are involved in the final approval or endorsement of these exercises. Then
So they decide what level they want they to achieve,
yes,
or
definitely, depending on the risk tolerance of the organization itself, because if the risk tolerance is low, for instance, then you might want to uh, put it on a higher security target level,
Mhm.
SLT4 for instance, or SLT3, which we
Yeah.
know would require the most set of countermeasures or controls to be implemented. And if the risk tolerance is not there, then they might accept the risk and move on, basically.
Mhm. Yeah, and then when they choose 3 or 4, they need more money then, huh?
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Definitely.
A poor asset owner or humble asset owners cannot say, "Oh, I want level 3."
Yes, that is true, and it's a very good point that you raised over here, because see, over the course of my career, I have come across environments whereby organizations would go on and define an SLT4,
Yeah,
but sometimes you have to look at the practical realities as well,
yeah.
as to whether that is actually achievable or not, because that would be the most stringent of the requirements that you would actually set your target for. And that's where most organization would fail, because at first they might not understand that what they are sort of signing
Yeah.
up for. But eventually then when they go down the path, then they realize, though, it will require a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, and a lot
Yes.
of cost to get to that SLT4 level. And I think this is where a pragmatic approach by the risk assessors come into play as well, right? And I think they play a vital role here to understand the context or the threat landscape of that particular industry that they are operating in, and how much budget they can actually allocate, for instance. And all these things need to be catered when you are performing those risk assessments and coming with the final output of those risk assessments and defining those SLT levels based on the risk tolerance, right? And because asset owners or the other SMEs might not understand at first, uh, you know, the implications of
Mm.
accepting an SLT4. So it's important for them, for the risk assessors and the people who are providing those reports to purely guide them, right, as to what it actually means.
Like you said, maybe they are, out of goodwill, they want to make the best effort, best investment. So they think
Correct.
aiming for 4 or 3 is the best thing, but they don't
Correct.
look at it
Correct.
like you, like how a consultant will look at it in a practical way.
Yeah.
Right.
Pragmatic way is always required.
Pragmatic, yes. Okay. I think remember when we talked, you said you worked in a water plant before.
Yes.
You did, yes. And
Utility sector.
yes, and as a consultant in Australia, this is out of the agenda question. So I'm just asking you, how do you find consultants and freelancers like maybe yourself or a company as yourself uh, operate in Australia? Uh, like, is it easy to make business there for freelancers and consultants
Uh,
in Australia? Yeah.
See, in Australia, normally people or big organization would rely on the niche consultancy firms basically to perform these sort of assessments, right? And what I've seen is basically, apart from the big four, there are a few niche consultancy firms out there that
Mhm.
focus purely on OT's cybersecurity landscape itself. And I have seen those companies grow over the years. So I've been in Australia for the past 10 to 12 years, and I've seen those companies grow, their value grow, and I've seen their footprints basically across the organizations that I've worked in. So if you're offering a niche or
Niche.
catering for a niche particular market, then definitely there is uh,
Mhm.
there are opportunities in this market itself. But of course, Australia comes with its own set of regulations
Mhm.
itself. There are particular uh, regulatory requirements, legislative requirements, basically, that we have to follow in Australia. So, for instance, there is recently the updated version of the SOCI Act that came, where we call it the SOCI, which stands for Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. It's sort of a
Nice.
legislative requirement basically that has come in, that has now put the asset owners, particularly operating these critical infrastructure assets, uh, uh, on a bit of a radar, basically, asking them to perform these sort of risk assessments, let the government know, what are the particular assets, critical assets, basically, within their environment. What are the sort of, controls, incident response plans, and stuff of that sort, basically, with regards to that. So, uh, as I mentioned, within Australia, you'll have, some sort of, their own versions of, the frameworks as well. So, giving you
Yes.
an example, for instance, within the electric utilities over here, normally we have a cybersecurity framework called ACSF, So it's Australian electric cybersecurity framework that our electric utilities have to comply with. It has a maturity framework as well. So so coming back to your question, if you're serving for that niche market, which OT security is, I would say, is still, it is a niche area. Yes, that not everyone is covering. So if you have the right sort of skill sets to bring, and you have the opportunities. Yeah, definitely.
Interesting. So you say OT security is considered a niche in the market. That means, does it mean that not a lot of organizations are looking for OT security, or they're not ready yet?
Well, I wouldn't say that way. Basically, from my perspective, it's the view that there are not many people out there that understand the OT security landscape, basically, that can provide you the right sort of consultancy. So I'm putting it from that perspective, right? Within organizations, all the critical infrastructure organizations here, you will find, their internal teams that are, formulating their CSMS, performing, these risk assessments, but they are always in need of, an outside view to come in and perform these risk assessments for them, perform these OT related pen testings, basically, which is, again, I would say, a niche area, basically. There is a difference between how you go about doing an IT pen testing or an OT pen testing engagement. So I was coming from that particular view.